I used to believe the worst part of living in an HOA neighborhood was dealing with the endless newsletters. Turns out, it's a whole different ballgame when your neighbor's teenage son decides your backyard pool is his personal hangout and his mother just so happens to be a lawyer with a god complex. I'm not saying locking my gate was the smartest move I've ever made, but I definitely didn't anticipate it would set off a legal ambush broadcast live to thousands of strangers online. It gets pretty wild. Stick around, because the twist at the end is something else. And seriously, have you ever had to handle someone like this in your neighborhood? Drop your stories in the comments. I read every single one. Welcome to QA Stories. Looking back, I probably should have seen all this coming from the start, but when you're staring at your bank account post-divorce, 18 grand feels like both a fortune and absolutely nothing. That was half of everything I had left in the world. And I decided to gamble it all on renovating my pool. Not my brightest moment, but I figured, why not take the chance? Oh, I'm Marcus Bell, by the way, 35, working as a property damage insurance adjuster. You'd think a job like mine would make me more cautious about investing in my own property. Apparently not. The thing about going through a divorce is, it strips away every certainty you thought you had. One day, you're planning a future with someone, and the next, you're dividing up coffee mugs and arguing over who gets the good Netflix login. My ex-wife and I had been married for 8 years. When everything fell apart, I ended up with the house in what seemed like a decent neighborhood and exactly $18,347 in my savings account. The house came with a pool. Though calling it a pool was being generous, it was more like a sunken concrete pit filled with algae green water and crushed hopes. I remember standing there in my backyard that first week after the divorce was finalized, staring at the disaster and thinking, maybe this could be my fresh start. Working in insurance had taught me a lot about property values, and I knew that a good-looking pool could seriously increase my home's worth. Plus, I worked from home most days, so I'd actually get to enjoy it. The pool contractor showed up and laid out the full scope of work: new liner, upgraded filtration system, resurfacing the deck, proper chemical balancing of the whole package. The price, $18,200. That left me with a whopping $147 to my name. While he was taking measurements of the deep end, the contractor casually said, "Someone's been swimming here during the day." I laughed and told him that was impossible. I worked from home and the pool had been drained for months. But he pointed out damp towel marks on my fence and a faint chlorine smell in the air that I hadn't really noticed before. "Trust me," he said. "I've been doing this for 20 years. These are the signs." That's when I started noticing details I'd missed before. The wet footprints that mysteriously appeared around the pool deck overnight. The way my pool chemicals were vanishing faster than expected, even with the brand new system. Subtle clues that someone was using my pool while I was inside working. I started feeling paranoid, like there were eyes on me, though I couldn't prove anything. Then one afternoon, Patricia Williams showed up at my front door holding an official-looking clipboard, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Patricia Williams, HOA president," she announced, as though I should be impressed. "Pool renovations need the proper paperwork to stay in compliance." I'd been living in the neighborhood for 6 months by then, and this was the first I'd heard about any HOA pool requirements. Patricia had this way of speaking that made everything sound like a legal threat disguised as polite conversation. She started firing off specific questions about my contractor, my permits, my property line as questions that felt way too detailed for what was supposed to be a routine HOA check-in. The whole time, I noticed a kid staring down at us from an upstairs window across the street. He had dark hair, looked around 16. When I waved, he just smirked and disappeared from view. "Is that your son?" I asked, nodding toward the house. Patricia's entire vibe shifted for a split second to protective, almost possessive. "That's Brandon," she said. "He's very interested in neighborhood activities." The way she said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a proud mom tone, it felt more like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that her visit wasn't random at all. That night, I decided to install security cameras. My experience in insurance had taught me that documentation is everything. If someone was using my pool without permission, I needed solid proof. The security company thought I was being dramatic. Most people put these systems in after a break-in. The technician told me, "You're trying to stop one before it happens." I ended up installing 4 cameras covering every angle of the pool and the fence line. Cost me $800 I could barely spare, but something in my gut told me I'd need the evidence. The very first night the cameras were rolling, they caught Brandon by my fence. He wasn't swimming or opening the gate out, just standing there, examining the camera angles, gently testing the latch, pacing around the perimeter like he was planning something. I watched the footage 3 times, trying to convince myself I was blowing things out of proportion, but the way he moved was too deliberate, too calculating. This wasn't a bored teenager, this was reconnaissance. The next day, Brandon came straight to my fence. I was working in my home office when I heard someone calling out, "Sweet setup. Dude, mind if I take a dip?" He was leaning on my gate, radiating this easy confidence that made it clear he wasn't really asking permission. I went outside and tried to keep things friendly. "You should probably check with your mom first," I told him. And just like that, his expression shifted. That relaxed facade slipped for an instant, and there was something cold behind his eyes. "I don't need to ask anyone," he said, then turned and walked away. Standing there, watching him go, it hit me that I just made myself a target. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just let him swim that first time. Maybe it would have saved me a world of trouble, or maybe that was never really an option. In the end, I had 2 choices: back down and lose the $18,000 I'd poured into my pool, or stand my ground and go up against a lawyer who seemed ready to use her own son as a weapon. You can probably guess which one my stubborn side chose. The next day, I came home from a client meeting and found 6 teenagers splashing around in my pool, music blasting, phones out recording every second. Brandon was orchestrating the whole scene like a movie director, telling his friends how to jump, where to splash, and which angles were best for their videos. "This is private property," I shouted, trying to keep my voice level and calm. Brandon stared at me like I just told them to stop breathing. "Relax, we're creating content," he said, barely glancing up from his phone as he kept recording. One of his buddies, a bleached hair, fake gold chain, and way more swagger than Sensei, actually laughed at me. "Don't be a Karen, old man." "Karen?" "I'm 35. But the part that really got to me was Brandon's reaction. He didn't even acknowledge that it was my pool, my backyard, or my $18,000 renovation. "Everybody out now," I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. I had no clue that any of this was being streamed live. Why would I, who expects to become the villain in someone else's 15-second clip? But there I was. Brandon had over 50,000 people watching our argument unfold in real time. Within an hour of me telling them to leave, there was a video circulating online titled, "Crazy Neighbor Tries to Kick Us Out of Community Pool." My face was suddenly all over the internet. People were leaving comments about finding out where I lived, contacting my boss, and basically trying to wreck my life. I still can't figure out how they made me out to be the bad guy. All I'd done was ask them to leave my own property, yet somehow, that's the version of events that took hold. The video racked up 10,000 views in its first hour. 10,000 strangers watching me insist a group of teenagers get out of my own pool, and somehow, I was the villain in their story. The comments were vicious. People threatened to call my employer, leave fake reviews for my insurance business, even made threats about what they'd do if they saw me in person. I'd never experienced anything like that tidal wave of instant hatred from people who didn't know me, didn't know the situation. I just saw a 30-second clip and decided I deserved to have my life ruined. The next morning, there was a letter from the HOA waiting in my mailbox. Cream-colored paper, fancy letterhead, and signed at the bottom by Patricia Williams, Esquire. That's when the realization hit me. Patricia wasn't just the HOA president, she was a practicing attorney. I couldn't sleep that night. I ended up Googling her name, desperate to feel like I was doing something. What I found made my fingers go cold. Patricia specialized in harassment cases. She'd been involved in 3 settled lawsuits, all right here in our development. Her law firm's website was full of testimonials from clients who'd won settlements over neighbor disputes and property harassment. One article in a local paper from 6 months back read, HOA president wins another settlement against neighbor harassment. Digging deeper, I discovered those 3 other neighbors she'd sued in the past 2 years. All of them settled out of court for amounts that were never disclosed. All of them moved away within months of the lawsuits. It was becoming disturbingly clear. This wasn't just random teenage mischief. It was a calculated operation, and I was the next target. But why me? What about my house, my pool, made it worth going to all this trouble? Meanwhile, the damage to my property was piling up fast. My pool equipment was vandalized. I had to replace the filter housing for $400 after someone cracked it. The decorative tiles around the pool edge were shattered in 3 spots, costing me another $300. The electronic lock on my pool gate had been forced open and hung limply, needing $150 to replace. I documented every bit of it. I took photos, saved receipts, kept meticulous records. My training as an insurance adjuster was kicking in, even though I was starting to realize this might be about a lot more than just property damage. I began second-guessing every glance from my neighbors, wondering if every polite smile was fake, if people secretly believed the narrative being spread online. A few neighbors quietly approached me, whispering that they were on my side but were afraid to say anything publicly. "Don't tangle with the Williams family," one older woman advised me while walking her dog. Patricia destroyed the Hendersons last year over a fence argument. They lost their house, but other neighbors seemed completely convinced by Brandon's social media posts. I'd get hostile stares at the mailbox. Conversations would stop the second I came near. I felt like a stranger in my own community. The scariest moment was learning about potential gaps in my insurance coverage. My agent explained that repeated trespassing and damage could impact my policy. "You've got to secure the property," he warned me. "If someone gets hurt while trespassing on your property, and it's an ongoing situation you haven't addressed, your coverage might not apply." Suddenly, my $18,000 investment wasn't the only thing on the line. I was facing the possibility of endless liability if someone got injured. And then Brandon posted another video, announcing, "Pool War Part 2 coming tomorrow." He promised an even bigger party, more friends, and better content for his followers. 20,000 people liked the video. 20,000 strangers convinced my pool was public property. 20,000 people who decided I was some kind of monster for wanting to keep control over my own backyard. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at my insurance paperwork, trying to figure out how my life had spiraled so far out of control. I knew I had to act. Every day I let this drag on, the damage grew worse, my liability increased, and my options were shrinking fast. Patricia Williams knew exactly what she was doing, weaponizing her son against neighbors who couldn't afford to fight back. But what she didn't realize was that my background in insurance had taught me one crucial lesson: documentation is everything. And sometimes, the best defense is forcing your opponent to reveal their hand. The following morning, I called a professional security company again. This time, not just for extra cameras but for an electronic locking system on my pool gate. It cost me another $300 I could barely afford, but I was finished being pushed around. Looking back, I can't decide if that move saved me or nearly ruined me completely. Maybe it did both, because things were about to get much worse. The third pool party in a single week left me staring at $800 in damages I had absolutely no way to cover. My pool pump was wrecked, the casing cracked open, water leaking everywhere. It would cost another $400 just to replace it. The deck furniture I'd spent months saving up for ended up at the bottom of the deep end, soaked and ruined beyond repair. That was another $300 down the drain. More of the decorative tiles around the pool's edge were cracked, and by that point, I was almost certain this wasn't just random damage, because it wasn't only about the destruction itself, it was the message behind it. A message that my property, my money, my life simply didn't matter to these people. Then my insurance agent dropped the real bombshell during a phone call that morning. "Marcus, I have to be upfront with you," he said. "This ongoing trespassing problem is impacting your policy. If someone gets seriously injured on your property during one of these incidents, your liability coverage might not apply." Hearing those words hit me like a splash of ice-cold water. Not only was I bleeding money from constant repairs, But I was facing the terrifying possibility of unlimited personal liability if one of those kids got hurt. "You have to secure the property immediately," he insisted. "We can't keep coverage in place if you're not taking reasonable steps to protect your property." That afternoon, I called the security company. It might have looked ridiculous as a suburban pool secured like a high-security vault, but I no longer cared about appearances. I was done trying to be polite and reasonable. It cost me $300 I didn't have, so I charged it to my credit card because my checking account couldn't handle another hit. The technician who came out was an older guy who clearly had plenty of stories under his belt. "Teenagers giving you trouble?" he asked as he drilled holes into the gate frame. When I explained the situation, he just nodded like he'd seen it all before. "You'd be surprised how often we deal with stuff like this," he said. "Usually it's commercial properties, though, not private homes." By 4 in the afternoon, the lock was installed. Heavy-duty metal housing, a 6-digit keypad, and a thick steel deadbolt that slid deep into the gate frame. The technician tested it several times to make sure everything worked perfectly, then handed me a little manual on how to program it. "Change the code regularly," he advised. "And whatever you do, don't share it with anyone you don't absolutely trust." I punched in a code that meant something personal to me, my ex-wife's birthday, reversed. She'd never need to use it, of course, but it felt like my own small way of reclaiming control over the chaos. When the keypad beeped, it felt like the first time I'd actually said number, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the pause before the next strike. I was in my home office when I noticed Brandon outside discovering the lock. I could see him through my window, growing more and more frustrated as he mashed buttons and yanked on the gate handle. Then he started live streaming again. "This psycho neighbor locked me out," he shouted into his phone. Crazy? Seriously? All I'd done was protect my own property, yet he made it sound like I'd barricaded the entire town's water supply. But this wasn't public property. It was mine. I'd bought it, paid for it, rebuilt it from scratch. "Check it out, guys," he said to his followers. "He actually thinks he can keep me away from the community pool." Community pool? Since when had my private backyard become public property? The live stream that night was pure chaos. Brandon had an audience of what looked like 20,000 viewers in the comments, and they were hyping him up, urging him to go further. "I'll show him what happens when you mess with the wrong family," Brandon proclaimed, pacing back and forth outside my fence. "Pool war finale tonight, guys. It's gonna be epic." The comments were filled with encouragement and increasingly dangerous suggestions. People were offering to send him tools or equipment to help him break in. I stood there in my kitchen, watching all of this play out on my phone screen, feeling a heavy knot of dread settle in my chest. What had begun as a simple property dispute had spiraled into something far more sinister. Brandon had turned my life into online content, and his audience was hungry for a show. The more outrageous things became, the more views he racked up. I was stuck inside someone else's social media narrative, and in that story, I was cast as the villain. Patricia Williams, curiously, was nowhere to be seen in Brandon's video that night, but I caught glimpses of her peering out through their front window. She wasn't stepping in to stop Brandon or calm him down. If anything, she seemed to be observing, studying the situation, waiting for her moment. And that terrified me more than any of Brandon's threats. Because with Brandon, at least I knew I was dealing with teenage bravado and social media theatrics. But Patricia? She was playing a longer, deeper game, and I had no clue what her next move might be. Later that night, I heard something slam into the gate with a loud crack. I checked my security footage and saw Brandon hurling a rock. It didn't break the lock, but it definitely sent a message. He wanted me rattled and afraid. The neighborhood's reaction to the new lock was a mix of quiet support and thinly veiled hostility. Some neighbors approached me cautiously that evening, whispering their approval. "You had to do something," one neighbor said softly. "This is out of control." But others seemed convinced that I was the one escalating the situation. I overheard people murmuring at the mailbox, "He could have just tried talking to the Williams family. Now he's turned this into some kind of war." That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every car door slamming outside sounded like it might be Brandon arriving with his friends. Every creak of the fence set my nerves on edge. I hadn't won anything. All I'd done was change the stakes of the fight. I kept checking the security cameras on my phone, scanning for any movement around the pool. The lock gave me a thin sense of security, but it had also obviously escalated the conflict far beyond anything I could have imagined. Close to midnight, I saw Brandon posting new videos from his bedroom window across the street. "Tomorrow morning," he declared to his followers, "I'm gonna show this crazy neighbor what happens when you try to lock kids out of their own neighborhood." The video was live to an audience of 15,000 people. The comments were growing more aggressive and violent by the second. People were suggesting he break the lock, cut through the fence, even vandalize my house. And what terrified me most was the look on Brandon's face. He seemed to be actually considering their suggestions. For a split second, I wondered if I should just remove the lock. Maybe I'd gone too far, escalated a situation that could have been handled with a simple conversation. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered the $18,000 I'd invested. I thought about my insurance coverage hanging by a thread. And I thought about Patricia Williams, who had already driven 3 other neighbors out of their homes. This wasn't just about teenage pool parties anymore. This was about whether I was going to let myself at the deck furniture I'd spent months saving up for ended up at the bottom of the deep end, soaked and ruined beyond repair. That was another $300 down the drain. More of the decorative tiles around the pool's edge were cracked, and by that point, I was almost certain this wasn't just random damage, because it wasn't only about the destruction itself, it was the message behind it. A message that my property, my money, my life simply didn't matter to these people. Then my insurance agent dropped the real bombshell during a phone call that morning. "Marcus, I have to be upfront with you," he said. "This ongoing trespassing problem is impacting your policy. If someone gets seriously injured on your property during one of these incidents, your liability coverage might not apply." Hearing those words hit me like a splash of ice-cold water. Not only was I bleeding money from constant repairs, but I was facing the terrifying possibility of unlimited personal liability if one of those kids got hurt. "You have to secure the property immediately," he insisted. "We can't keep coverage in place if you're not taking reasonable steps to protect your property." That afternoon, I called the security company. It might have looked ridiculous as a suburban pool secured like a high-security vault, but I no longer cared about appearances. I was done trying to be polite and reasonable. It cost me $300 I didn't have, so I charged it to my credit card because my checking account couldn't handle another hit. The technician who came out was an older guy who clearly had plenty of stories under his belt. "Teenagers giving you trouble?" he asked as he drilled holes into the gate frame. When I explained the situation, he just nodded like he'd seen it all before. "You'd be surprised how often we deal with stuff like this," he said. "Usually it's commercial properties, though, not private homes." By 4 in the afternoon, the lock was installed. Heavy-duty metal housing, a 6-digit keypad, and a thick steel deadbolt that slid deep into the gate frame. The technician tested it several times to make sure everything worked perfectly, then handed me a little manual on how to program it. "Change the code regularly," he advised. "And whatever you do, don't share it with anyone you don't absolutely trust." I punched in a code that meant something personal to me, my ex-wife's birthday, reversed. She'd never need to use it, of course, but it felt like my own small way of reclaiming control over the chaos. When the keypad beeped, it felt like the first time I'd actually said number, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the pause before the next strike. I was in my home office when I noticed Brandon outside discovering the lock. I could see him through my window, growing more and more frustrated as he mashed buttons and yanked on the gate handle. Then he started live streaming again. "This psycho neighbor locked me out," he shouted into his phone. Crazy? Seriously? All I'd done was protect my own property, yet he made it sound like I'd barricaded the entire town's water supply. But this wasn't public property. It was mine. I'd bought it, paid for it, rebuilt it from scratch. "Check it out, guys," he said to his followers. "He actually thinks he can keep me away from the community pool." Community pool? Since when had my private backyard become public property? The live stream that night was pure chaos. Brandon had an audience of what looked like 20,000 viewers in the comments, and they were hyping him up, urging him to go further. "I'll show him what happens when you mess with the wrong family," Brandon proclaimed, pacing back and forth outside my fence. "Pool war finale tonight, guys. It's gonna be epic." The comments were filled with encouragement and increasingly dangerous suggestions. People were offering to send him tools or equipment to help him break in. I stood there in my kitchen, watching all of this play out on my phone screen, feeling a heavy knot of dread settle in my chest. What had begun as a simple property dispute had spiraled into something far more sinister. Brandon had turned my life into online content, and his audience was hungry for a show. The more outrageous things became, the more views he racked up. I was stuck inside someone else's social media narrative, and in that story, I was cast as the villain. Patricia Williams, curiously, was nowhere to be seen in Brandon's video that night, but I caught glimpses of her peering out through their front window. She wasn't stepping in to stop Brandon or calm him down. If anything, she seemed to be observing, studying the situation, waiting for her moment. And that terrified me more than any of Brandon's threats. Because with Brandon, at least I knew I was dealing with teenage bravado and social media theatrics. But Patricia? She was playing a longer, deeper game, and I had no clue what her next move might be. Later that night, I heard something slam into the gate with a loud crack. I checked my security footage and saw Brandon hurling a rock. It didn't break the lock, but it definitely sent a message. He wanted me rattled and afraid. The neighborhood's reaction to the new lock was a mix of quiet support and thinly veiled hostility. Some neighbors approached me cautiously that evening, whispering their approval. "You had to do something," one neighbor said softly. "This is out of control." But others seemed convinced that I was the one escalating the situation. I overheard people murmuring at the mailbox, "He could have just tried talking to the Williams family. Now he's turned this into some kind of war." That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every car door slamming outside sounded like it might be Brandon arriving with his friends. Every creak of the fence set my nerves on edge. I hadn't won anything. All I'd done was change the stakes of the fight. I kept checking the security cameras on my phone, scanning for any movement around the pool. The lock gave me a thin sense of security, but it had also obviously escalated the conflict far beyond anything I could have imagined. Close to midnight, I saw Brandon posting new videos from his bedroom window across the street. "Tomorrow morning," he declared to his followers, "I'm gonna show this crazy neighbor what happens when you try to lock kids out of their own neighborhood." The video was live to an audience of 15,000 people. The comments were growing more aggressive and violent by the second. People were suggesting he break the lock, cut through the fence, even vandalize my house. And what terrified me most was the look on Brandon's face. He seemed to be actually considering their suggestions. For a split second, I wondered if I should just remove the lock. Maybe I'd gone too far, escalated a situation that could have been handled with a simple conversation. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered the $18,000 I'd invested. I thought about my insurance coverage hanging by a thread. And I thought about Patricia Williams, who had already driven 3 other neighbors out of their homes. This wasn't just about teenage pool parties anymore. This was about whether I was going to let myself a broken bar just trying to get his ball back. Patricia kept repeating to Officer Reed, her voice trembling with righteous fury. "This man stole my son's property and then set a trap when Brandon tried to retrieve it. I tried. God knows I tried. But every time I opened my mouth, Patricia swooped in like a hawk descending on prey in a courtroom. All I had were facts." She had an entire story. I wanted desperately to explain that I'd never seen that basketball in my life, that Brandon and his friends had been trespassing in my pool for weeks without permission, that everything was captured on my security cameras. But every time I started to speak, Patricia cut me off with another accusation wrapped in legal jargon. Officer Reed looked exhausted, like a man who had dealt with far too many neighbor disputes for one lifetime. "We'll need to review all the evidence," he said carefully, "including your security footage, sir." And that was when it hit me. Everything was going to come down to those cameras. If the footage showed Brandon scaling my fence and trespassing, I might be in the clear. But if there was even a hint that it looked like I'd deliberately trapped him, I was utterly screwed. I handed over the files, but a chill crept up my spine. Something felt off about Brandon's entire performance, the way he fell, the way he cried out, the limping that switched from one leg to the other. It all seemed rehearsed, like he'd practiced it before. As I passed the evidence to Officer Reed, I felt a growing certainty that my gut was right. This was all orchestrated. But what I didn't know was that my unease was nothing compared to the bomb Patricia was about to drop. The lawsuit arrived the very next morning. At precisely 7 a.m., a process server showed up on my doorstep, crisp suit and all, clutching an envelope that seemed to weigh 10 pounds. My stomach sank the moment I saw it. $50,000. Patricia Williams wasn't just threatening legal action, she'd already filed the paperwork. I sat on my kitchen floor, holding 37 pages of legal jargon in my trembling hands, staring at the print as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. I kept flipping pages, half hoping that maybe on page 38 there'd be a note saying "just kidding." There wasn't. The lawsuit spelled out, in precise legal language, that I was a monster who'd built elaborate traps designed to harm children, unlawful detention of a minor, emotional distress, child endangerment, reckless creation of dangerous conditions. Every possible claim that could stick was spelled out in black and white, professionally formatted and officially filed in county court. This wasn't something whipped up in a few frantic hours. This had been carefully prepared long before Brandon ever got tangled in my fence. But the true gut punch came when I read the damages section. I'd seen numbers like this only in fraud investigations and catastrophic claims during my years in insurance. But now a broken bar I was the claim. $50,000 for emotional distress, $25,000 for Brandon's ongoing therapy, $15,000 for medical expenses tied to his supposed serious injuries. Punitive damage as amount to be determined at trial. They were demanding a sum large enough to bankrupt me 3 times over. And the worst part was, I knew I couldn't afford to fight it. Even if I managed to win, the legal costs alone would devastate me financially. This was Patricia's double-edged trap. Not only was I still facing potential criminal charges from that 911 call, but now I was staring down a massive civil lawsuit at the same time. Every lawyer I spoke with that morning gave me the same bleak assessment. This could cost you $30,000 to $50,000 to defend properly. One attorney told me, even if you win, you're looking at significant legal expenses. You may want to consider settling. Settling with what money? My $18,000 pool renovation now looked like the worst mistake of my life, growing more expensive by the hour. Meanwhile, Brandon was turning into a social media martyr of the highest order. He started posting daily videos, giving dramatic updates about his trauma from the incident, complete with close-ups of scratches and tiny bruises that could have come from a stumble off a bike. "I think I need therapy," he declared in one video. This crazy neighbor completely destroyed my sense of safety in my own neighborhood. Then, naturally, a fundraising page popped up. Help Brandon heal from neighbor attack. It raked in $1,200 in a single day. The online campaign against me was relentless and frighteningly well organized. My fascia, the face I barely even liked looking at in the mirror, was suddenly everywhere, mummified, blown up into screenshots, dragged into captions that made me sound like some suburban boogeyman. Pool Trap Karen started trending locally. Someone had even created fake business listings under my name for my insurance work, flooded with 1-star reviews calling me a danger to children. 3 potential clients canceled meetings with me after seeing those videos online. Patricia's attack wasn't just legal, it was systematic destruction of my entire reputation and livelihood. 2 days later, another process server showed up at my door, this time delivering a settlement offer. Patricia described it as generous. $75,000. That's what she believed my silencia and my futuria was worth. That's what my pool, my name, my sanity were apparently valued at to make this nightmare vanish. "We're being generous," the letter claimed, considering the severity of Mr. Bell's actions and the lasting trauma inflicted on Brandon. Generous. They were demanding more money than I'd ever held in my life for the simple act of locking the gate around my own pool. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus on my work. Every knock at my door felt like the next piece of legal doom. Every phone call might be another client backing out because they'd found the viral videos. Meanwhile, The criminal charges hung over me like a sword. Officer Reed still had my security footage under review, and the investigation was far from over. Patricia, of course, kept calling the police with new complaints. Noise violations for running my pool filter. Harassment allegations because I checked my own mailbox. She even filed a stalking report after she saw me looking out my kitchen window. Neighbors were picking sides, and I was losing the fight. 3 families on my street signed a petition demanding the HOA take action against my aggressive behavior toward children. The woman who'd warned me about the Williams family wouldn't even make eye contact anymore. Even the neighbor who'd initially supported my decision to install the lock had started hurrying past my house, avoiding conversation altogether. I was turning into a pariah in my own neighborhood, and part of me started wondering if maybe Broken Bar they were right. Maybe I really had snapped. Maybe I was becoming the monster they claimed I was. A broken bar, the story she was spinning, and that thought, it stuck with me. It followed me to bed, sat silently beside me at the breakfast table. It wouldn't leave me alone. Was I being too harsh somehow? Had I overreacted to a bunch of teenagers having pool parties? Maybe I should have just gone over and talked to Patricia instead of installing cameras and locks. Maybe I really was the villain in this story, and everyone else could see it except me. The constant accusations, the online attacks, the neighbors turning away from me, it all made me start questioning everything I thought I knew. I spent hours poring over my security footage, desperate to find anything that might help prove my side. The cameras showed Brandon climbing over my fence, clear as day, showed him getting stuck, showed the entire incident, beginning to end. But Patricia's legal filings claimed the videos were doctored. She insisted I'd edited the footage and deliberately created a dangerous situation to entrap children. Somehow, my evidence was being twisted into proof of my guilt. 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I was genuinely considering Patricia's settlement offer. $75,000 would financially wreck me, but maybe that was still better than the alternative. I found myself running numbers in my head. Could I sell the house, declare bankruptcy, start over somewhere else where nobody knew about pool traps and social media witch hunts? I'd already scheduled a consultation with a bankruptcy attorney for the following Monday, but that weekend, something pushed me to watch the security footage one more time. I couldn't even say what I was hoping to find. Maybe just a shred of clarity to help me make sense of how things had spun so wildly out of control. I must have watched Brandon's fence climbing incident 50 times, analyzing every frame. Over and over, I kept thinking, something isn't right. The way Brandon fell a broken bar, it didn't look accidental. The way he screamed, the way he twisted his body, it all seemed a broken bar choreographed. Like he knew exactly how to fall, exactly how to get stuck, exactly how to create a perfect spectacle for an audience. What would you do in my situation? Pay up and lose everything anyway, or roll the dice and fight? Because I was about to find out that sometimes, if you're desperate enough to keep looking at a broken bar, you might discover something that changes everything. For 3 straight days, I barely left my house. I barely answered my phone. I sat in my home office, staring at hours upon hours of security video, every angle, every timestamp, like some obsessed detective in a crime documentary. My neighbors must have thought I'd completely lost it. The breakthrough finally came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. I'd gone back to footage from the week before Brandon's fence stunt. I was trying to piece together a timeline when I noticed something strange. Brandon was in his backyard, but he wasn't swimming, he wasn't playing basketball, he wasn't doing normal teenage stuff. At first, I thought he was stretching. Maybe he played sports, but then he fell. Not stumbled, fell, deliberately, and then he did it again. I rewound the video and watched more carefully. Brandon was practicing falling down. I'm not even kidding. He was in his backyard, repeatedly throwing himself to the ground, testing different ways to hit the dirt, practicing how to cry out in pain, perfecting how to make it look real. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe he was rehearsing for a school play. Maybe he was into stunt work or something. But then a broken bar, he pulled out a makeup kit. Not face paint, not kid stuff. Professional grade theatrical makeup, a fake blood, bruise colors, red smears. I froze. Who does that? I blinked, rewound, blinked again. This couldn't be real. But there it was. again and again. This wasn't some teenage prank. This was a scheme, a performance, a premeditated con. And the next footage was even more damning. Patricia wasn't just lurking in the background as she was directing. She was standing there with one hand on her hip, the other gesturing sharply in the air. "Fall faster." I imagined her saying, "Cry louder." I couldn't hear the audio at that distance, but I could see the way she pointed at different spots on Brandon's body, how she counted off on her finger so 1, 2, 3 and Brandon would drop to the ground in different styles. She was coaching him. This woman was literally training her son to fake injuries, practicing multiple scenarios like it was a twisted theater rehearsal. I kept digging. The more I watched, the worse it got. There were sessions where Patricia and Brandon stood in their backyard discussing something intently, Brandon taking notes as she talked. There were practice runs of him climbing fences and pretending to get stuck in various ways. They even practiced his emotional reactions. The tears, the panic, the shouts for help. Every single detail from that night at my fence had been rehearsed down to the second. The final nail in the coffin came from footage 3 days before the fence incident. Brandon was in his yard, phone propped up on a stand, recording himself over and over. He fell, he cried out, he applied fake blood, he limped dramatically. He was literally testing his performance to see which version would look most believable for his audience. And Patricia was right there, guiding him, like a director on a movie set. I didn't sleep at all that night. I didn't even change clothes. I just waited, pacing my living room, rehearsing what I'd say. This was my one shot. I called Officer Reed first thing in the morning. My voice shook with a mix of fury and relief. "You need to see this," I told him. "I found something that changes everything." He agreed to come over later that morning. For the next few hours, I worked non-stop, organizing every piece of video evidence into a timeline, making sure I could show Officer Reed exactly what I'd discovered. This was my one chance to prove I wasn't the villain they'd painted me to be. When Officer Reed finally arrived, I sat him down and started playing the footage in chronological order. Brandon's practice falls, Patricia's coaching, the fake blood, the rehearsed crying. And as the videos played, I watched Officer Reed's face change. A broken bar. Officer Reed's expression grew more serious with each clip. Finally, he looked at me and said, "This changes everything. We're looking at fraud here," he continued. "Insurance fraud, false police reports, a possibly conspiracy to commit fraud. This is serious." The digital forensics team got involved and things escalated fast. They recovered deleted messages from Brandon's phone and social accounts, DMs with friends talking about getting this racist's house, screenshots of online tutorials about faking injuries, even a planning document laying out their entire strategy. They'd researched me, my job, my insurance, my financials. This wasn't random. I hadn't just been unlucky. I had been targeted because they thought I was vulnerable and couldn't fight back. When presented with the evidence, Brandon completely fell apart. The cocky teenager with 50,000 followers was gone. In his place was a scared kid who finally realized how deep he was. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he sobbed to Officer Reed. "Mom said we needed the money for college. She said this guy was crazy. So it was like justice." It was clear, Brandon had been manipulated. His remorse was real, but so was the damage he'd done. The investigation widened. And that's when the full scope of Patricia's operation came to light. It was staggering. 3 neighbors had already been victims, sued and forced to settle. The schemes varied slightly each time, but the pattern was always the same: stage an incident, fake the injuries, and sue for a payout. In just 3 years, she'd racked up over $200,000 in settlements, all while serving as HOA president, all while practicing law. It was a full-blown fraud enterprise, and her son had been trained to help her run it. Even as the evidence piled up, part of me couldn't believe it. This woman, my neighbor, a respected attorney, had been running an operation like this from right next door. When Brandon came to apologize under police supervision, it was the hardest moment of all. He looked like a completely different person. No swagger, no ego, just a frightened teenager. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Bell," he said quietly. "I know what we did was wrong. Mom said you were trying to hurt our family." Boot to broken bar. "I know that wasn't true. Even with everything we'd uncovered, I still wasn't sure they'd actually arrest them. Patricia was a lawyer, Brandon was a kid. I knew sometimes the justice system didn't always do what it should, but I was about to find out which way it would go. They came quietly. 3 police cruisers rolled up at 8 o'clock a.m. Calm, methodical, like it was just another Tuesday. But for me, it was the ending I never thought I'd get. I'll admit I watched from my kitchen window, heart pounding, like I was watching a live episode of some twisted suburban drama. Officer Reed led the operation. It was clear he wanted the neighborhood to see what was happening. Brandon was arrested first. I watched Reed approach their door, warrant in hand, voice steady. "Brandon Williams, you're under arrest for multiple counts of criminal trespassing, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing false police reports." From my window, I could see the handcuffs click around his wrists. After weeks of being dragged through the mud, being called a monster, a Karen, a danger to child Trina, it felt surreal to finally see the truth catch up. He looked at me then, not with anger, not with fear, just a broken bar confusion, like he couldn't understand how the story had flipped. Tears streamed down his face, not for the camera this time. This wasn't performance, this was regret. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bell," he shouted through sobs as they walked him to the squad car. "I didn't want to do it." Even from a distance, I could hear the change in his voice. This wasn't the arrogant teen who'd invaded my pool. This was just a kid who'd been used and was now paying the price. Patricia's arrest was louder. She came out screaming and waving papers, shrieking about injustice. "You can't do this," she yelled. "This is harassment. You're destroying my son's future over pool access." Pool access. Even in handcuffs, she was still trying to rewrite the story, still pretending this was all about a basketball or some backyard misunderstanding, still pretending she wasn't the architect of a fraudulent operation that had ruined multiple lives. Officer Reed addressed the crowd that had gathered. People needed to hear it straight. They needed the truth. "Multiple counts of criminal trespassing," he announced, voice clear. "Conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, filing false police reports, child endangerment through involvement of a minor in criminal activity." One neighbor clapped just once, loud and awkward, but it echoed in the silence like a gavel hitting a bench. The trespassing charge was what people understood best. Brandon had been on my property repeatedly, without permission, caught on camera every time. That's what this was really about in the end. Not just lies or manipulation, but property, privacy, and the rule of law. And finally someone had enforced it. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Justice was finally being served, but watching a teenager's future unravel because of his own mother's manipulation was hard to witness. The cameras were everywhere, neighbors' phones, police body cams, even local news crews who somehow arrived just in time. It was the visual confirmation everyone needed, that actions have consequences, no matter your age or who your parents are. The media swarmed. Within hours, our quiet street was headline news. HOA president and son arrested in elaborate insurance fraud scheme. That was the headline on the 6 o'clock news. Overnight, the crazy neighbor narrative flipped. People started digging deeper, and suddenly, I wasn't the villain anymore. Patricia's law practice collapsed within the week. Victims who had settled quietly in the past came forward, realizing they'd been conned by a calculated fraud ring. The state bar opened a formal investigation into her conduct. The HOA board held an emergency vote to strip her of her position. Everything Patricia had built to her reputation, her authority, her schema crumbled in days. Brandon's sentence was less harsh and more instructive. He was ordered to complete community service at local pools, helping with safety programs and maintenance. The judge didn't yell. She didn't need to. "You're going to learn what it takes to keep a pool safe," she told him. "Maybe then you'll understand the value of other people's property." And somehow, that hit harder than any fine. 6 months later, something I never expected happened. Brandon knocked on my door, not to cause trouble, not to film, but to apologize again. He asked if he could help with my pool maintenance as part of his service. I was skeptical, but what I saw wasn't the smug kid with thousands of followers. This was someone changed, a humbled, grounded, sincere. Working together on the pool became a strange form of therapy. He was good at it, actually, and understood chemical balances, filtration systems, safety procedures. I never realized how much work this was. he said one afternoon, scrubbing a filter. Back when I was just jumping in and filming, I thought it just kind of existed. I never thought about the cost or effort. He paused and looked up. You ever going to forgive me? I didn't answer. I just handed him the pool skimmer. That was enough. Healing the neighborhood took longer. The people who had once supported Patricia's version of events eventually had to face the truth. Some apologized outright. Others just started treating me like a human being again. At the annual neighborhood barbecue that fall, for the first time in months, I felt like part of the community and not its cautionary tale. Patricia moved out 3 months after her arrest. Last I heard, she'd resurfaced in another state, still practicing law, still walking that razor-thin ethical line. I try not to think about whether she's scamming someone else. That's her story to deal with. I've got my own life to live. Now, there's a sign by the pool. It reads, "Community welcome, may please ask." Funny thing is, it was never just about the pool. It was about the fear that lived behind every door, the silence before every knock. Now a broken bar people knock. Because after all we went through, I figured a little communication never hurt anyone. The lock is still there. Some habits are hard to break. But now there's a process, a sign, a conversation. It's amazing how much chaos you can avoid when people just talk honestly instead of scheming. And yes, the cameras are still rolling. Not because I'm paranoid, because documentation saved my life once, and I'm not about to forget that. Actually, it was Brandon who suggested keeping them active as part of the new safety protocols. Evidence protects everyone, he said. Honestly, I couldn't argue with that. So that's the story. The HOA Karen's son called 911 after I locked my pool, and yeah, he left in handcuffs, just like the title promised. But here's what the title doesn't tell you. 6 months later, he was helping me maintain the pool. Turns out the kid had a good heart under all that fake bravado. He just needed someone to show him the difference between consequences and cruelty. The pool's still here, still locked, but now it comes with a sign and a lesson. Ask first, because sometimes the smallest requests can prevent the biggest messes. As for me, I learned that sometimes you have to lock your pool a broken bar to unlock the truth. And sometimes, the best investment you'll ever make is in your own dignity. The $18,000 I thought I wasted on a renovation, turns out, it was the cost of finding out that standing up for yourself is always worth it, even when the whole world calls you crazy. And yeah, the cameras are still rolling. Old habits, hard lessons. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thanks for sticking with me. Would you have handled it the same way, or just sold the house and moved to Alaska? Let me know in the comments. If this kind of neighborhood chaos speaks to your soul, hit that subscribe button. I post stories like this every week, real, petty, personal, and just the right amount of unhinged. From all of us here at HOA Stories, thanks for watching. Smash the like button, and I'll see you next time.